please just join me in a warm welcome for Rebecca Goldstein.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a thrill for me to be here. Amanda just said that in her wonderful talk that she wasn't going to bore you with philosophy, and I just said to her, no, that's my job. I've probably agonized over this talk more than any other talk in my entire career, which is why I actually wrote it out, which I never do. The source of my agony is this: do I, for the first time in my life, publicly address the gender issue? Yes. Okay, I gotta throw this out there. My MO has always been to try to behave as if my being a female doesn't matter insofar as my professional life is concerned. I write my books, I give my lectures, I pursue and argue my ideas, and I behave always as a matter of principle, and probably cowardice, as if my being female doesn't matter. I try to behave as if the world is the way I know it isn't, in the hopes that my behaving as if it were will help a little bit to make it so. My subject matter has never been determined by my gender. My academic training, my Ph.D., is in philosophy of science, not a particularly female subject. And within philosophy of science, I concentrated on physics, also not particularly a female subject. And even as a novelist, because I do sometimes stray and write novels, I'm often described or accused, is perhaps more apt, of writing not like a woman. Although, of course, the accusation isn't put into so many words. It's never put into so many words. Rather, I read such damning praise of my work as it's being coldly cerebral. Doesn't that make you want to just run out and buy the book? And I know that my being described in such terms has much to do with my being a female and the unconscious expectations that are in play as soon as a reader, including a critic, knows the gender of an author. Wanton subjectivity rules in literary criticism. How could it not, when subjectivity is the very stuff of literature? But that means that biases, blithely unconscious and therefore all the more powerful, hold sway. Criticism of literary criticism, sort of second-order criticism, can be used as a handy tool for unearthing buried biases. It's okay for women to write certain kinds of books, namely those that are only read by other women, but then those books are ipso facto deemed not serious literature. And should a woman write as if her gender doesn't matter, she's called such things as coldly cerebral. My engagement in both the worlds of professional philosophy, particularly philosophy of science, and of literary fiction, the arts and the sciences, has afforded me just a wonderful vantage point for viewing the many subtle ways in which gender biases, so often unconscious and all the more powerful for that, play out, undermining women, making them feel hesitant to enter the fray, although that doesn't seem to be the case here, and increasing the likelihood that even if they do enter the fray, their temerity will be rewarded by their being dismissed, sidelined, mockingly misconstrued, or the most effective means of all ignored, their voices just not heard. In forcing myself in preparation for today to think about the dreaded gender issue, I polled several prominent women that I'm fortunate enough to know, some in academia, both the sciences and the humanities, as well as in the arts and in public activism. And I asked them if they ever feel, I think they thought I was the most naive person in the world, if I ever feel that their gender undermines them professionally, and if so, how? And I'm talking very prominent women here. Almost to a woman, they reported the experience of being in a discussion or at a meeting and saying something that nobody hears. It's just as if they hadn't spoken at all until the comment is picked up and repeated by a man, and then everybody jerks to attention. You've all had the experience. Being unheard when you speak, or being interrupted and misconstrued before you've had a chance to explain yourself, it's just not one of life's greatest experiences. It doesn't contribute to the sense that one's life is flourishing, especially if the greater part of your life is devoted to pursuing ideas. Now, obviously, it's altogether true that compared to the more violent manifestations of misogyny, unspeakable atrocities, genital mutilation, or acid thrown in the faces of little girls trying to go to school, it's easy to dismiss what we privileged women, privileged in so many ways, not least of all in inhabiting these enlightened spheres of ours, experience. In fact, compared to these more violent manifestations, we privileged women can feel petty, voicing complaints, and so can so easily be made to feel ashamed when the comparative paltriness of our slights are pointed out to us as if we weren't aware of these obvious disparities in the orders of injustice. Psychologists call these small but relentless, I'm not even sure if I'm just imagining it and maybe I'm being hypersensitive, assaults, microaggressions. And they cite evidence that for women, as well as for other marginalized groups in our society, these microaggressions coming from good people, our people, take more of a psychological toll than overt hate-filled attacks. Here's a quotation from a book by the psychologist Daryl Wing Su called Microaggressions in Everyday Life. It's quite a good book. I read it in preparation for today. Quote, "It is easier for people of color and women to deal with the overt and deliberate forms of bigotry than the subtle and unintentional forms because no guesswork is involved. It is the unconscious and unintentional forms of biases that create the overwhelming problems for marginalized groups in our society," unquote. In coming to address, if somewhat belatedly, these issues of gender bias as they continue to play out even in the most enlightened spheres of our most enlightened society, even in our own highly select circle of pro-reason, pro-science compatriots, I've come to link these gender issues in my mind to what I consider another, I don't know if failing is too strong a word, but I'm going to use the word failing, that our secular community often commits when it thinks about and talks about religion, or so it seems to me. So I'm going to switch gears for a moment and talk about this other issue, and then circle back to the gender issue. As secularists with strong scientific orientations, we've concentrated almost exclusively on the ways in which religious mythologies recklessly abuse what William James called the will to believe. We've valiantly tried to rein in this wild will with sound epistemology and explanatorily superior science, which is all to the good. I don't advocate stinting on sound epistemology and explanatorily superior science. But there's another irrepressible will that finds expression in religion that we've largely ignored, even though we scientifically oriented secularists are, like all people, powerfully moved by this particular will ourselves. Many of us have trouble recognizing it, perhaps because it's working so much better for us than it does for the bulk of humanity. And I'm talking about the will to matter. I was first led to this notion of the will to matter and other ideas about mattering by one of my fictional characters. I would never have thought of these ideas on my own, especially back then. I thought of myself back in those days as a rigorous philosopher of science. I took a lot of pride in my rigor. I did a little philosophy of mind on the side, but it was rigor. And these ideas about mattering weren't rigorous. They were soft. But my editor asked me a question regarding a particular character of mine, a young woman named Renee Foyer, who was a protagonist in my first novel, The Mind-Body Problem. My editor said, I don't really understand Renee. She's so bright and she's so attractive, and yet she's so unhappy, always on the verge of despair. Why? So I thought about my editor's question, or rather, I had Renee Foyer think about it. And since Renee was not as rigorous a philosopher as I was, in fact, that was a large part of her problem. She was a graduate student in a rigorous philosophy department, and she, unlike me, couldn't hack it. She came up with these complicated ideas about mattering. Renee turned out to be quite the theoretician of mattering. So I'm going to let her explain it. Quote, to matter, not to be as not. Is there any human will deeper than that? It's not just unqualified will, as Schopenhauer would have it, that makes us what we are, nor is it the will to power, as Nietzsche had theorized, but something deeper, of which the will to power is merely a manifestation. We want power because we want to matter. And the will to create, to procreate, these two are expressions of the will to matter, deeper even than the will to survive. We don't want to live when we become convinced that we don't, can't, will never matter. We'll give up our lives to a cause if we become convinced that that's what it takes to matter. It seems we no sooner discover that we are than we desperately want that which we are to matter, end quote. So that was one of Renee's ideas, the will to matter. And then there was her idea of the mattering map. And again, I'm going to let Renee explain it. Quote, people occupy the mattering map. The map is a projection of its inhabitants' perceptions. A person's location on the mattering map is determined by what matters to him or her. Matters overwhelmingly, the kind of mattering that produces his perceptions of people, of himself and of others, of who are the nobodies and who the somebodies, who the deprived and who the gifted, who the better never to have been born, and who the heroes. Everyone loves a hero. What we differ on is the question of who the heroes are, because we differ over what matters. Who matters is a function of what matters. Here, where I am, what matters is intelligence. The people who matter are the intelligent. And the people who matter the most, the heroes, are the geniuses, unquote. Renee goes off and marries a genius and lives to regret it. Renee answered my editor's question about her own despair by way of her theory of mattering. She inhabited a region of the mattering map in which she felt her own mattering to be seriously in doubt. She sees this as one of the fundamental ways in which human life can go wrong. I was intrigued by her ideas about mattering, and it turned out some other people were as well. Just last year, that book was published 30 years ago. Just last year, a psychologist named Ellen Kashek got in touch with me, telling me of the award-winning work she's done on mattering maps and informing me of something I hadn't known, which is that the idea of the mattering map has become a working theoretical construct, as we call it in philosophy of science, in certain branches of psychology. This really intrigued me, that my fictional character's idea had been incorporated into actual theoretical work. And so I Googled mattering maps for the first time, and I was astonished to get tens of thousands of hits, far more than for me. Which implies I'm not getting credit. One of the first hits was an article in the Harvard Business Review, co-authored by the prominent economist George Lowenstein, one of the founders of behavioral economics. I knew something of his work. The article was called, quote, How Mattering Maps Affect Behavior, unquote, and it used the idea of mattering maps to demonstrate the inadequacy of the standard model of rational choice theory. And sure enough, it's my fictional character's idea. that are quoted there in the Harvard Business Review. Quote, "We discuss the social dependence of preferences and its implications for economics by pursuing the idea that in different social settings, different things are valued. The concept of mattering maps captures this insight, as Rebecca Goldstein expresses it in the novel from which we adopt both the idea and the terms," and then he goes on to quote some of Renee's ruminations on mattering maps. On the whole, I was pleased that my character's ideas have been enjoying such an active theoretical life independent of her, not to speak of independent of me. But in fact, I too have been thinking a great deal, not publishing on it, but thinking a great deal about the concept of mattering in the 30 years since a fictional character first suggested its importance to me. I've been thinking about mattering in regard to the questions of moral reasoning and how progress in moral reasoning can be described as progressive discoveries, and I do use that scientifically sanctified word, discoveries, in regard to facts about mattering. Mattering is a concept that can be made to do a lot of ethical heavy lifting, in addition to psychological lifting. It spreads itself out over matters of fact and matters of value, giving the lie to what Stephen Jay Gould had portentously called the non-overlapping magisteria, or noma, if you remember that bit of nonsense that ceded to religion dominion over values. I've also been increasingly thinking about issues of mattering in relation to the question of the great emotional appeal of the religious myths and traditions that still thrive today. What is it that keeps intellectually sophisticated people, and coming from a very religious family filled with very brilliant people, I often, who are still religious and still brilliant, I'm often taken aback by the imputation of stupidity to the religious. I know it empirically to be false. I have counterexamples. What is it that keeps intellectually sophisticated people clinging to propositions about the world so improbable that they can be described, if you'll allow me to use the technical terminology of epistemology, as just crazy-ass shit? Archaeologists say that belief in the supernatural, animistic spirits of nature lodged in animals, wind, trees, rivers, sun, moon, extend back at least 30,000 years to Cro-Magnon man, whose cave paintings, which required their gaining access to tortuously inaccessible places, are interpreted as expressions of supernatural beliefs. Why else go to all that inconvenience? But the religions that still matter, that still resonate with huge swaths of our contemporaries, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, and of course, the Abrahamic religions, were all originally forged during the period that the philosopher Karl Jaspers dubbed the Axial Age. It's roughly between 800 and 200 BCE. And Jaspers also pointed out that that very same period saw the emergence in ancient Greece of secular philosophy, as well as tragic drama. This was a really conceptually, normatively fertile period of human history. Jaspers calls this period the Axial Age because these traditions still extend out into our day. Its radials or axials still resonate with millions of people, including us secularists, who are the inheritors of the Greek tradition. What characterizes the formation of all of these axials, including the Greek, is a preoccupation, or so it seems to me, with the issues of mattering. And now I'm using my own language, I'm superimposing it over Jaspers' views. What erupts quite forcefully in the Axial Age over large reaches of the globe, China, India, Persia, all around the Mediterranean, Judea, and into Europe, is the sense that some lives achieve mattering and others don't, raising the possibility that perhaps there's something a person can do that will make the difference as regards his or her own mattering. The question roiling beneath the various radials is, what is the human life that matters? The thought that there might be a chance of achieving a life that matters and that you might personally blow it, meaning that you might as well not have bothered to show up for your existence at all, for all the difference it's going to make, creates the special conditions of the axial age. These are their preoccupations, which continue to be our preoccupations, which makes it not so surprising that the proffered answers still resonate throughout the globe still. Why was it precisely during this period identified by Jaspers that the question of individual mattering struck such a chord? A big question, and my first approximation of an answer is that it had something to do with the emergence of cities during this period, which introduced a level of anonymity and impersonality into human life, so different from tribal village life where all relations were determinately personal, as well as introducing, along with the anonymity, greater choices. Some anthropologists have pointed out that the core period of Jaspers' axial age correspond almost exactly to the period in which coinage was invented. And my guess is that the introductions of markets and of money providing an impersonal measure of wealth intensified the impersonalization inherent in the emergence of the large city-states. And all of these interrelated developments, and I'm sure there are more, thrust the question of personal mattering and how to achieve it forward into consciousness, coaxing out these various visionary answers. The ancient Greeks, to whom I am very partial, are part of the axial age. Their extraordinary achievements are a response to that period's preoccupation with mattering. I don't think we can understand their extraordinary achievements unless we place them in that context. What's so remarkable about the Greeks is that despite the fact that religious rituals saturated their lives, their gods and goddesses are everywhere, and they had to be propitiated or something really terrible would happen. Their rituals were mainly apotropaic. They were meant to ward off evil. But despite that, the omnipresence of these gods and goddesses, when it came to the question of what it is that makes an individual human life matter, they tended not to look to their gods, but rather tried to answer the question in human terms. And that's amazing. They're approaching the question of human mattering in human terms is the singularity, I'd argue, that created the preconditions of philosophy in ancient Greeks. The Greeks, or at least a certain segment of them, developed, even back in the Homeric age, what I call the ethos of the extraordinary, an attitude that the only life that matters is the extraordinary life. The unexceptional life is not really worth living. How many of us still hold to that today? Your life must be such as to attract the attention of other mortals, not the attention of the immortals. You really don't want that, you know. Something pretty bad usually happens, at the least a rape, if you attract the attention of the immortals. What you want is the attention of your fellow mortals. That's the measure of mattering. Only a life that impresses others, that causes the poets to sing of you, a song-worthy life, a life of superiority, of exceptionality, of what they called arete, which has the same root as our word aristocracy, a life that would result in acclaim, fame, auditory renown, what they called kleos, which derives from the Homeric word for I hear. Live so that others will hear of you. It's the only way to defeat the oblivion of death. Achilles, that petulant, spoiled brat who spends the bulk of the Iliad pouting in his tent, sometimes strumming on his lyre and singing of fame, allowing the blood of his comrades in arms to soak the Trojan soil, miffed that Agamemnon took the girl who was his lawfully won Trojan booty. This guy was esteemed, even into the classical age of Plato, the greatest of the Greek heroes. why. His heroism certainly wasn't a matter of his giving any consideration to the question of how his actions would affect anyone other than himself. No Bentham-like utilitarian calculations as to what will conduce to the greatest good of the greatest number of people ever creases the beautiful brow of Achilles. Nor is his singular heroism a matter simply of his prowess in war or his metaphysically mixed parentage, his mother was a goddess, or his godlike beauty, though of course these characteristics all mark him as eminently songworthy, necessary but not sufficient. The item on his CV that puts him over the top is the choice he made. He was given the choice, in fact by his goddess mother, Thetis, of a long but ordinary life or a short and extraordinary life, and he chose the latter. Plato has Socrates in the Apology, which is Plato's presentation of Socrates on trial for his life, compare himself to, of all people, Achilles, saying he will not bargain with his 501 Athenian jurors for his life. He was, of course, being charged with impiety and corruption of the young. That he would make the choice of Achilles and choose the extraordinary, if shorter, life. Of course, Socrates was already 70 years old. So it was too late to have a short but extraordinary life. But still, the statement indicates how much, I think, the Socrates-Plato team, who of course brought us philosophy as we know it, still bought into the general Greek attitude of the ethos of the extraordinary, while also modifying it in line with their view that it's reason, and only reason, that can confer mattering on human life. They refined the vulgar, general credo that the unexceptional life is not worth living to read the unexamined life is not worth living, which of course Plato also has Socrates say at his trial in the Apology. Right across the Mediterranean from the philosophical Greeks were the still obscure tribe that called themselves the Ivrim, the Hebrews, who were approaching the problem of how to matter by formulating a theism that eventually involved a one and only God, the source not only of the physical world without, but of the moral world within. And of course, our normative culture still is a very uneasy mix of these two disparate approaches to human mattering pursued by these two Mediterranean peoples, the Greeks and the Hebrews. The one group approaching the question of human mattering in human terms, although severely restricting membership in the mattering class, and the other approaching human mattering in divine terms. I was brought up as a little girl to believe that all my deeds, all of them, down to a bite from a friend's Hostess Twinkie, which didn't carry the right kosher certification required by my very Orthodox Jewish family, all of those deeds get inscribed in a heavenly book, which come the autumnal days of awe would be tallied up so that I might be judged. That was really terrifying, but it was also quite effective in inducing a robust sense of mattering. It mattered to no less than the Lord of the hosts whether I took a bite of that Hostess Twinkie. All of the radials that extend from the so-called Axial Age, not just the religious mythologies, but what the Greeks devised as well, self-critical reason, were prompted by preoccupations with human mattering, the concern not to blow this one and only life of ours. But of all the visions addressing human mattering that emerged during that period, only one has substantively changed, has evolved, has made progress, has even, through its tortuously self-critical methods to which we commit ourselves when we commit ourselves to reason, corrected its own false presuppositions and intuitions, which tend to favor our own personal mattering and those who are like us over those whose lives we have trouble imagining ourselves into. And that, of course, is secular moral reason initiated by the Greeks. It's by that means that we know, at least in principle, that every human life matters, or rather what we know is the conditional that if any of us is entitled to a life of mattering, and it's all but impossible to pursue one's life without believing that you are entitled to mattering, then all of us are so entitled to a life of mattering. There's a grandeur in this mattering view of life. Together with the grandeur of the scientific view of life, the two joined in the progress we've made along that reason-seeking radial that reaches back to the Greeks, the implications of which, both scientific and moral, we're still in the process of unfolding. It takes us a really long time. The will to matter is some powerful stuff. It spawned the religions of the Axial Age that still claim the allegiance of the many who can't imagine their lives mattering where they deprived of their mythological scaffolding. But it spawned, too, the tradition of secular reason to which we are the heirs, the secular reason that has progressively corrected the mistakes to which our species is prone, including mistakes about the facts of mattering, the sense of mattering without which a full and flourishing life can't be lived. Ethical behavior is behavior that does justice in ways both large and small to the will to matter in all of us. And what is it that microaggressions do? They undermine a person's sense that she matters, which is all the worse when the people doing the undermining are those who matter to her, those who share her region of the mattering map, and so can't be as easily dismissed as the ranting bigots and the slobbering misogynists. Mattering matters. Without sensitivity to the will to matter, not only can't we understand the continuing force of religion in the lives of the many who otherwise feel that they don't matter, their lives subject to the same depersonalization and devaluation that gave rise to the religious visions of the Axial Age in the first place, which is why I think social justice cannot be separated from secularism. No way. But we also fail to understand the secular ethical progress to which we are the heirs and upon which we wage an assault, whether macro or micro, every time we undermine a person's sense that he or she matters. Thank you.